We are honored to have the opportunity to hear Air Commodore retired Leonard Birchall speak to us today on the topic of leadership. Air Commodore Birchall graduated from RMC in 1937 and was commissioned in the Royal Canadian Air Force. He was a squadron leader and deputy commander of the 413 RCAF Squadron and was flying one of the lead aircraft that was transferred to Ceylon in early 1942. At the end of an all-day patrol southeast of Ceylon in search of submarines and shipping, he sighted the Japanese Navy fleet steaming towards Ceylon, preparatory to launching a surprise air attack on Colombo, Ceylon, similar to the one this same fleet had carried out on Pearl Harbor. He immediately sent off a signal giving the location, speed, course, and composition of the fleet. His aircraft was shot down by Japanese naval carrier fighter aircraft. However, his signal gave sufficient time to allow preparations to be made for the impending attack. The result was the British fleet was able to avoid destruction and the island to defend itself, inflicting severe losses on the Japanese naval aircraft. As a result of this action, he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and the title of Savior of Ceylon. Picked up by the Japanese Navy, he and the remnants of his crew were taken to Japan and placed in prisoner of war camps, where his conduct resulted upon his release in being awarded the Order of the British Empire for gallantry. As senior Allied officer in the camps in which he was located, he continually displayed the utmost concern for the welfare of his fellow prisoners. It is his time as a POW that he will share with us today. Air Commodore Birchall provides proof to us that it is essential to act ethically, even in the most life-threatening and complex circumstances. And his words give us a glimpse into the extraordinary life of this officer. Not just as a POW, but the way he has conducted himself throughout his life provides us with exceptional examples of ethics in practice. He has been dedicated to both the military and civilian communities. To the military community, he has donated his time as a permanent member and a reserve member. In fact, on 21st of April 1996, the Air Commodore completed 62 years of service with the Canadian Armed Forces and is the first member of the Canadian Forces to ever receive the 5th bar to the CD. He still gives lectures to Canadian Forces schools, speeches, and reviews parades. He has also been an active member of the civilian community and has been awarded the Order of Ontario for his achievements. While doing his duty as Canadian observer of the general election held in Sri Lanka, Air Commodore Birchall became aware of the terrible conditions in the Sri Lanka hospitals due to inadequate facilities and serious shortages of proper supplies and equipment. Upon his return to Canada, he organized and sent out a large sea container with over 8 tons of hospital supplies to Sri Lanka, and did so entirely at his own expense. Furthermore, in 1992, he became aware of a serious requirement for a suitable building at the local Girl Guides summer camp. He took over the project and had it designed and built at his own expense. Besides these notable examples, Air Commodore Birchall does volunteer work and assists in fundraising activities for many charitable organizations. His story needs to be told, and his example of Canadian values is a national treasure.
Can you hear me all right? Good. You all right in the back there? Last time I asked that question, some clown in the back said no, and everybody in the front got up and moved to the back. I apologize for my copious notes, but at my age and this past July I became 82 years young. There are 3 serious losses which you encounter in your physical capabilities. First, your eyesight goes dim, and you will note the rather strong lenses in my glasses. Second, your hearing is not too good, and I admit that I am in great need of a hearing aid. Third, and I'll be damned if I can ever remember what that one is. Thus I must stick closely to my text, or I shall wander all over the place. Actually, there's a fourth serious loss in our physical capabilities, which we old chaps encounter, but we do our utmost not to even think about that one, let alone discuss it, as whenever we do, all we do is sit around and cry. You will note that it is necessary for me to take frequent sips of water, and this is due to the fact that during my indoctrination into Japanese culture, which was administered with severity by clubs of various sizes, all too often I would zig when I should have zagged, and the damage to my throat has finally caught up with me, resulting in my having to have a series of drastic surge throat operations and intense radiation treatments, leaving me with a perpetual dry mouth and throat. So I ask you to bear with me. On 21 April 96, as you've heard, I qualified for the 5th bar of my CD, having completed 62 years of undetected crime in the Canadian services. And hence the greatest part of my life has been spent in the Canadian military. Now, Napoleon once said, "There are no bad men, only bad officers." The question then is, have I been a good or a bad officer? And here there is no set criteria or standard. Some believe that the best measure of success is the rank you attain, but I do not accept this. Some of the finest men I have met, served with, and held in the highest regard were not necessarily those who were the most senior. One thing I do recognize as a measure of success is leadership, as everyone that I have held in high esteem has had that quality, and this I believe to be essential for success in any walk of life. As a member of the armed forces, and regardless of rank, the opportunities for development and use of leadership are immense, and the satisfaction you will derive is equally so. There is still that old adage, however, that you can lead a horse to water, but you cannot make him drink. Of course, the other version, too, where you can lead a horse to drink, but you can't make him water. Thus, while you will have these opportunities, the success you will achieve depends entirely on the amount of effort that you put forth. Nothing is ever free in this life or handed to you on a plate, and the price you must pay is hard work, total effort, and self-sacrifice. I would now like to give you my concept of leadership and the reasons for my beliefs. Incidentally, the most succinct definition of leadership that I've ever heard is being able to tell somebody to go to hell and have them look forward to the trip. If you ever have to lead your troops into combat, and I pray to God this will never happen, you will find that you appear before your men stripped of all insignia and outward signs of authority to command. Your leadership is judged not by your rank, but by whether your men are completely confident that you have the character, knowledge, and training that they can trust you with their lives. Now, men are shrewd judges of their leaders, especially when their lives are at stake, and hence your character and knowledge must be such that they are prepared to follow you, to trust your judgment, and to carry out your commands. Let us now examine those two major things which the men look for in their leaders, and the first is character. And here I believe that the prime ingredient, the absolute cornerstone, is integrity. Integrity is one of those words which many people keep in the desk drawer labeled too hard. It is not a topic for the dinner table or cocktail party. You can't buy or sell it. When supported with education, a person's integrity can give them something to rely on when their perception seems to blur, when rules and principles seem to waver, and when they are faced with the hard choices of right or wrong. It's something to keep them afloat when they are drowning. If for only practical reasons, it is an attribute that should be kept at the very top of a young person's consciousness. Without personal integrity, intellectual skills are worthless. As the ancient Roman philosopher Epictetus said in the field manual he produced for the Roman soldiers in approximately the year 50 A.D., "It is better to die in hunger, exempt from guilt and fear, than it is to live in affluence with perturbation." This means that you must demonstrate the utmost honesty in everything you do in your dealings with superiors and subordinates alike, both on and off duty. It is this that inspires your men to carry out a similar integrity. When they know your word is your bond, then confidence and trust will permeate the entire unit. The men will feel they can come to you, their leader, with the bad news as well as the good news. Never shoot the messenger, as this will just discourage others from giving you the honest feedback needed for you to command. You must report the good, the bad, and the ugly up the chain of command to your superiors. There is no substitute for honesty in our profession. What we do is just too important. Integrity also means having the courage to take the full responsibility for your actions and those of your subordinates. Don't quibble. Don't try to shift the blame. Don't look for scapegoats. If you or your command is fouled up, then fess up and press on. In doing so, you will set the right example for your men and earn the respect of your subordinates and superiors alike. Nothing destroys a unit's effectiveness and leadership quicker than the leaders not taking the sole responsibility for their actions. And the first sign of this is usually careerism or CYA factor, which very often has the tendency to first appear in the higher headquarters. Once started, it rapidly feeds on itself and spreads like wildfire down through the entire organization. At the first indication of this selfish, self-centered, self-serving attitude, you must take every step possible to root it out and replace it with integrity. The second major thing which the men look for in their leaders is knowledge and training. It is essential that you ensure you have the knowledge, information, and training necessity for you to properly assess and solve the problems which will face you and your men. All this must be done to the very best of your ability, regardless of the size or importance of the problem. Never accept the second best or mediocre solution because you think the problem is not worth your time and effort. If you don't have the necessary knowledge and information, then go get it by asking for assistance, advice, guidance, doing research, until you are satisfied that you have everything you need to reach the best solution. Then carry out that solution with your full-out effort and determination. Another point that the men look for in you as their leader is your concern and effort on behalf of the welfare of those who serve under you. You must prove beyond any doubt that you are fair and just in your dealings with them and that you genuinely like and respect them. In all circumstances, you must place their well-being ahead of your own, regardless of the cost to yourself. Finally, one other and perhaps equally important factor is that once you are accepted as a leader, your men will not only follow you, but they will also emulate to the best of their ability your character and behavior. That is why, as a leader, you must at all times and in all places set and maintain the highest of standards. Let us now put these bits and pieces into service life and see the results in actual practice. In doing so, I'd like to use the 3.5 years of life that I spent as a POW to demonstrate the reasons for my belief. The great social historians, the Durants, have said that culture is a thin veneer that superimposes itself on mankind. This is very true. And when men are stripped of this veneer and every other vestige of civilization, are treated and live as animals as we were forced to do as POWs, then the laws of the jungle soon take over. And it is in this environment that the true basics of leadership emerged for me. When I first arrived in Japan, courtesy of the Japanese Navy, I was sent to a special questioning camp under the Japanese Navy at a place called Ofuna, a suburb of Yokohama. This was a special interrogation camp where we were placed in solitary confinement in small cells. No speaking allowed. We were questioned and beaten every day. We were not considered as POWs, but rather we were still on the firing line and could be killed at any time. I was moved from this camp after 6 months when they brought in a U.S. Catalina crew, which was shot down out of Dutch Harbor, and I was sent to the starting up of the working camps in the Yokohama area. The first working camp I went to was located in a baseball stadium in the center of Yokohama, which had been built by the Standard Oil Company. We were housed in a large indoor area under one of the grandstands, and I arrived there the same day as the first batch of prisoners from Hong Kong. There were 5 officers with this group of approximately 300 POWs. Now, in Hong Kong, the Japanese had raped and banded nurses, women, and children. They'd killed doctors and patients in the hospital wards, operating theaters, and recovery rooms. They had bayoneted, mutilated, shot, and beheaded POWs just to amuse themselves. They had humiliated and degraded them in every way possible. No medical treatment or supplies for the sick and wounded, the lowest possible living conditions, and way below standard diet. We were joined 2 months later by 75 POWs from the Philippines, and these were some of the survivors from the Bataan Death March, where over 16,950 POWs were killed, over 2/3 of the entire total number of POWs involved. All these prisoners, both the Hong Kong and the Philippine POWs, had then to endure the hell ships where thousands died en route from Hong Kong and Manila to Japan. In one ship alone, the Arasan Maru, out of 1,800 POWs, only 8 survived. The Orinoco Maru started out with 1,619 POWs, and only 200 survived that trip. The order sent by the Japanese Tokyo headquarters down to Hong Kong and the Philippine camps was to send their best and healthiest prisoners to work in Japan. Now, as you well know, when a commanding officer gets an order to send his best men, this is when he unloads all his deadbeats, no-gooders, troublemakers, sick, wounded, incompetents, etc. Thus, I found myself to be the senior POW in this brand-new working camp, and faced with over 375 very hostile, belligerent POWs. This gave me some concept of how poor old Daniel felt when he walked into that den of lions. I was a senior POW in all the working camps that I was in, but this was a title in name only, as with no means of physically exerting discipline, you had only the vast inherent responsibilities for the health and well-being of all those in the camp, but no means to enforce your decisions. The nature of military discipline encompasses 2 basic forms: the imposed discipline and the discipline which the individual decides is necessary, which is self-discipline. Field Marshal Sir Archibald Wavell, in his book Soldiers and Soldiering, describes this as follows, quote, "Discipline makes a man do something he would not do unless he has learnt that it is the right, the proper, and expedient thing to do. At its best, it is instilled and maintained by pride in oneself, in one's unit, in one's profession, and only at the worst by fear and punishment." Unquote. Now, in our case, punishment was completely out of the question. The conditions and environment in which we existed reduced our health to the very razor edge of complete collapse, and we needed every bit of our health, strength, stamina, and reserve to barely keep living from day to day. Having to undergo punishment on top of all this would have been tantamount to issuing a death sentence. Thus, the authority we had was only that which the men wished to give us when and if they felt like it. As officers, we were singled out by the Japanese for special treatment. Every method possible was used to degrade us in front of the men in order to counter any control or discipline we might try to develop. From the men's point of view, all officers were under great suspicion. They felt they had been let down and that the incompetence of their officers was responsible in large part for their being prisoners. Another sad factor was that after being captured, unfortunately, a lot of the officers' prime concern had been for themselves. They had taken the best quarters, furnishings, clothing, and supplies available, and only after they had taken what they wanted or considered their share as an officer did the troops get what was left. This was particularly true in the distribution of food. Since the POWs were on a starvation diet, food was of the greatest importance, as it meant life or death. When the officers took more than their equal share of the daily ration per prisoner, it not only meant that it drastically reduced the food left for the men, but also the men's chances of survival. So the first night we were in the Yokohama camp, we, the 5 officers from Hong Kong and myself, decided that we had to share the privations, maltreatment, and work at least equally with the men, and this could only be done by demonstrating that we took on an obviously greater share than the men. We immediately set up a system whereby the food and everything else that we received was dished out in full view of the men. If anyone thought he had less than an officer, he was free to exchange his share for the officers, and no questions asked. The officers were always the last to take up their share. The men tried us on by eating some of their food and then changing it for an officer's bowl, but in no time the troops themselves sorted this out, and woe betide anyone who tried it. In fact, in a way, this backfired, as when the Japanese reduced an officer's ration because he was sick or as punishment, the men themselves made certain that the officer still received his fair, an equal share, and in some cases more than his share. Cigarettes became the currency of the POWs, and with the horrible conditions and starvation under which we lived, the addiction to tobacco increased beyond belief. It seemed that when you were smoking, you could, to a limited degree, blot out reality and ease the continual terrible pangs of hunger. Men who were starving, never without intense hunger, 24 hours of the day and every day of the year, knowing that their very lives depended on the small bits of food we got, would still trade away their food for cigarettes. We, the officers, gave up smoking, which was no easy task itself, but in this way we removed ourselves from any criticism and were able to put our ration of cigarettes into the ration for the men, and also to create a small supply for our doctor to be used in keeping the heavily addicted from trading away their food. Anyone offering to buy or sell food for cigarettes was reported by the men themselves to the doctor, who would then talk to those involved and take remedial action. In this way, our lives were made much more bearable and many lives were saved. Another immediate action we took was whenever a Japanese guard started to beat up a prisoner, the closest officer would jump in between them. The prisoner would get lost as quickly as possible, and the officer would take the beating. Sometimes the guard would become bewildered to find he was beating the wrong man and would stop, whereas sometimes he would become infuriated and take it out on the officer. We just had to take our chance and hope for the best. A word about dress and deportment. Clothing was at an absolute premium, as we only had what we had with us when we were captured. The only clothing issue we ever were given was that what the Japanese had captured and then did not want for themselves or could not use in other ways. Believe me, the pickings were very slim indeed, and we lived in rags and tatters. The clothing issues we were given all went to the men, but again, in short order, the men made certain that every officer had one good shirt, tie, tunic, trousers, and hat to wear whenever we had to parade in front of the Japanese. We were given 1 square inch of soap per week with which to do all our laundry and to keep our bodies clean. There was no hot water, and even the cold water was in very limited supply. We were allowed 1 hot and sometimes only a lukewarm bath once a month. The supply of razors, razor blades, hair clippers, scissors, needles, thread, and all other such normal items were only those which had been brought into the camp by the men after their surrender. It was therefore impossible to maintain the normal standards of cleanliness. In addition, we were out of the camp for about 12 hours of the day, doing coolie labor on starvation diet. The result was that we were sick, starving, cold, filthy, infested with lice, fleas, and bed bugs, but unable to find the time, energy, or the means to do very much about it. But despite all this, through the height of ingenuity and improvisation, we still managed to keep ourselves as best we could. When we turned out on parade, it may have been in rags and tatters, but we were as clean, upright, formidable, proud of our heritage, and still as undefeated as we could possibly be.